The Louis Burke Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College presents 10 years of best-selling authors and great thinkers. Each week we broadcast new videos from our 10-year speaker archive online for free at our website. We look forward to seeing you again when it's safe. Please enjoy this presentation from the archives of the Louis Burke Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College.
My name's Lorraine Gallucci, and I'm the Director of Continuing Ed and Special Programs here at Hunter. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight to our first event of the fall season, and it's featuring Cathleen Schine. Tonight I'm standing in for Louis Frumkes, who couldn't be with us. But as Louis would say, the show must go on. The Writing Center, through continuing education, is excited to be able to continue to offer the very best in cultural and intellectual presentations and workshops to Hunter College and the New York City community. The success of the Writing Center is a direct result of the generosity of benefactors who support our program. As the fall semester progresses, so will our special events series. If you notice, there are brochures on your chairs. This season we're including National Book Critics Circle Award winner Edward Hirsch, who will be here next week, and Kitty Pilgrim, who's an anchor and correspondent for CNN. Please join our writer-in-residence, Barbara Goldsmith, a noted author and historian, on December 2nd. Our Tina Santi Flaherty Winston Churchill series features speakers Randolph Churchill, great-grandson of Sir Winston Churchill, and Paul Reed, a newspaper feature writer who completed the biography of Winston Churchill, The Last Lion. Dates for these events are highlighted in the brochure. This June will also mark the annual Writers' Conference in its fourth year at Hunter. The conference features distinguished writers, editors, publicists, and literary agents promoting hope for the new generation of publishing. This four-day event is widely considered to be one of the finest fiction and nonfiction conferences in New York City. Past keynote speakers have included Mary Higgins Clark, Erica Jong, and Walter Mosley. And tonight, we're pleased to welcome author Cathleen Schine. Cathleen Schine jokes that having failed as an intellectual, she discovered her calling as a pseudo-intellectual who went on to write for The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and Family Circle. If truth be told, Cathleen Schine is a first-rate woman of letters and the author of the internationally best-selling novels The Love Letter, which was made into a movie starring Kate Capshaw, and Rameau's Niece, which was also made into a film, The Misadventures of Margaret, starring Parker Posey. Add to these books Alice in Bed, To the Birdhouse, The Evolution of Jane, The Three Weissmans of Westport, and her most recent bestseller, Finn and Lady, and you'll become aware that you are talking about one of America's most talented writers. Also a distinguished essayist and literary critic, one of Kathleen's essays, Dog Trouble, originally published in The New Yorker, was included in the Best American Essays of 2005. It gives me great pleasure this evening to welcome Cathleen Schine on behalf of the Writing Center. Kathleen.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and I also want to thank Louis, even though he's not here, for inviting me. And thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? And there are not too many pops? Okay. I'm going to, I thought Louis sort of sent me this note saying it would be a Q&A. But since he's not here to do the Q, I'm going to read a little tiny bit of my most recent book and then talk a little bit, sort of providing my own cues, and then I will hope that you all will have some questions for me to fill in for Louis. So this most recent book is called Finn and Lady, and it's a kind of it's a story about forming a family, an unusual kind of eccentric family, and it's also a kind of love story between a little boy and his half-sister, who's much older than he is, who becomes his guardian. And it's really how they both learn to protect each other and also to tolerate each other. It takes place in the 1960s, most of it. And so it's about two people trying to grow up in a time when growing up was not really fashionable. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the very beginning. The book it's both a sad novel and a comic novel. This beginning part is may make it seem a little darker than it really is, but it's the beginning. So I will read you just a couple pages. Finn's funeral suit was a year old, worn 3 times, already too small. He knew his mother was sick. He knew she went to the hospital to get treatments. He saw the dark blue lines and dots on her chest. "My tattoo," she said. She sang Popeye the Sailor Man and raised her skinny arms as if to flex her Popeye muscles, to make him laugh. He knew she was sick. He knew people died, but he never thought she would die. Not his mother, not really. Lady came to the funeral, an unmistakably foreign presence in the bare white congregational church. She wore large sunglasses and wept audibly. Finn's neighbors, the Pounds, who raised big, thick Morgan horses, had been looking after Finn since his mother was taken to the hospital. "I'm sure your mother knew what she was doing," Mr. Pound said doubtfully, when he saw Lady Hadley approach, her arms open wide, a lighted cigarette dangling from her lips. "I don't think she had much choice, dear," Mrs. Pound whispered to him. "There was no one else, was there?" "I like Lady," Finn said loyally. But she was terrifying, coming at him like some mad bird with a squawk of "Fratello mio, it's all so dreadful." Lady put her arms around him and held him close. She was all he had, as Mrs. Pound had pointed out. All he had. He barely knew her. Unfamiliar arms, a stranger's cheek, wet with tears leaking from behind her dark glasses. He wanted to cry too, for so many reasons that they seemed to cancel one another out. He stood there like a statue, nauseated and faint. The other mourners stared at Lady. Why wouldn't they? She stood out. She vibrated almost in that quiet church. She was beautiful. Finn liked her hair, which was long. He liked her teeth. She thought they were too big, but she was wrong. She was like a horse, not one of the Pounds' heavy Morgan horses with short, sturdy necks and thick, clomping legs. She was like a racehorse, jittery, majestic. Her long neck and long legs, and her face, too. She had a horsey face in a beautiful way. And bangs like a forelock. He'd told her that the last time he'd seen her. He had been 5. "You look like a horse," he'd said. "Charming," said Lady. "Me and Eleanor Roosevelt." He had not meant that at all. Eleanor Roosevelt, whose picture he'd seen in the newspaper, did not look like a horse, more like his grandmother, big, sloping breast, important face. He meant that Lady's eyes were huge and dark, that her cheekbones were high and pronounced, that her face was aristocratic and long, that her hair flew in the wind like a mane, that she was coltish, even in her movements of tentative wildness and reckless dignity. He didn't know that he meant all that when he was 5. He just knew that she reminded him of a horse. He was 11 now. He had not seen her for 6 years. She still reminded him of a horse. A racehorse, he had added when he was 5, and Lady had smiled and said, "Oh, that's all right then." When the funeral was over, Lady would not allow him to go to the grave site. "It's barbaric," she said to Mr. and Mrs. Pound. They looked at her with shocked faces, pinched by hurt at what they rightly took to be Lady's dismissal of every aspect of almost 2,000 years of religious tradition. "The kid is hanging on by his eyelids," she said. "I saw Daddy buried," Finn said, "and Grandma, and Grandpa." "I rest my case," said Lady. "You're the boss," Mr. Pound said. He heaved a sigh, then he shook Finn's hand and wished him luck in his new life. Mrs. Pound hugged him and said he'd make his mother proud in heaven, and then he did start to cry and ran outside. Humiliating to cry at his age. Babies cried. The Pounds had a baby, a bald, sticky one that screamed for no reason, out of the blue. Mrs. Pound would pick it up and hug it. Finn wanted to shake it, although really he could not imagine even touching it. It was an obnoxious baby. "I'll give you something to cry about," Finn's father used to say. Then he died. The Pounds baby had its parents. Stuart was its name. Finn had taken one of its toys and given it to the dog. The baby didn't even notice. So that's all I'll read for now. And I thought I would just take some of the questions that people tend to ask when there is a Q&A and ask myself, just to get going, and then you can ask me some other questions. So the first question, and I'm just going to change my glasses so that you don't look as blurry. The first question that one of the first questions that people often ask is, did you always want to be a writer? And the answer to that is yes and no. There was a period when I was growing up when my most fond ambition was to be a graduate student. That's what I wanted to grow up and be. That's because my mother was a graduate student in psychology, and I thought that was a wonderful career, being a graduate student, since my mother was a graduate student for a long time. Then I also was horse crazy, so I decided I could combine my career as a graduate student with my love of horses and become a horse psychologist. I passed through that stage, and then I also wanted to be a writer, and by the time I was in high school, of course, I wanted to be a poet. So then another question that people ask is, when did you actually start writing? And I wrote little stories when I was young, and my mother got me a book called So You Want to Be a Writer, which was a wonderful book and very supportive, and I would write little stories. But then by the time I was in high school, it was time to be a poet, which meant it was time to write really, really bad, overwrought poetry, which I did for a long time, and it was really bad and really overwrought and kind of hysterical and romantic in that high school 60s way. And by the time I got to college, I decided, no, I absolutely could not be a poet because I couldn't possibly let anyone see this poetry, which I was starting to understand was really terrible, So I would obviously become a medieval historian. So I transferred colleges, and I had started at Sarah Lawrence. I went to Barnard, which had a great medieval studies program, and then I went to the University of Chicago to get a master's degree, or I hoped eventually a PhD in medieval history. And the problem was that, as I and the university soon discovered, I have a really terrible memory, which is difficult for a historian. And I have a particular problem with names, dates, and abstract ideas. So this did not really, it just wasn't working out. But during this time, I was living in Chicago, and I was going through some of my stuff, and I found this folder, which I can still see now, is a big fat folder, and it was full of all of my high school horrible poetry. And I thought, oh my God, I have to get rid of this instantly, but I can't just throw it away because the garbage man might read them. So, I mean, even the paper and the ink was embarrassing. The paper was like, really thin, crinkly paper, and if they weren't typed, or blue paper, and if they weren't typed, they were written in, purple ink, and it was just very overwrought is the only word I can think of. It was Baroque. So I decided I couldn't throw them up, so I took them to the dump. To the Chicago dump, which was quite an experience. The Chicago dump at that time, I don't know, I haven't been there since, oddly, but at the time when you stood on it, I guess it was landfill, and it would kind of move as you stood there. So I stood there kind of rocking on the dump and got rid of this fat folder of bad poetry. Now, here's one of the really good things there are many difficult things about being a writer, but there are also many wonderful things, and this is one of them. Years later, when I had given up the idea of being a medievalist, I was in Connecticut at my mother's house, and I went up into the attic for something, and I saw, to my horror, what seemed like the identical folder of the identical horrible poems. And it seemed that my mother had kept copies, it was like a good mother, had kept copies of all these, it was like an Edgar Allan Poe story. They had followed me from Chicago, and I couldn't kill them. And I was horrified, and you know that feeling when you're by yourself but you just blush? That I was sitting there in the hot attic blushing at these poems. But I was in the middle of writing a book that later became The Love Letter, and I thought, oh, I'll just have Helen, the main character of this book, go up into her mother's attic and find all these horrible, embarrassing, all these poems, and I'll use some of them, which I did. So that's one of the benefits of writing is you get to take things that are awful, embarrassing, painful, sad, and suddenly that you can look at them slightly differently, and you can say, oh, this is material. And so I always feel like I'm, a Native American, kind of trying to use every part of the buffalo, and use all the sinews and everything. Anyway, so grad school was a disaster, and so I came home to, as I think a lot of people do these days, and certainly did in those days, I came home to my mother's guest room. There I lived for a while, not knowing what I was going to do. I kind of, for a moment, I thought, well, I had a fellowship one summer to go to Italy, and I went to Florence to study paleography, which is handwriting, essentially, because in the Middle Ages they would use a lot of abbreviations and weird punctuations, and you had to know them in order to be able to date things and also to read things. But while I was there, I spent most of the money and most of the summer and most of the stipend buying shoes. So I thought I should become a buyer at Bloomingdale's because obviously I liked shoes, so I should become a buyer. So unfortunately, I had at this point never had a job. I'd only gone to school and graduate school and summer programs, and so I was unqualified to become a buyer or even an assistant buyer or even an apprentice assistant buyer. And so I did not get a job in that field. And so things were not looking too good. And I was, kind of depressed and sleeping late. And my mother was coming in with the New York Times, and it would have big circles, which would be jobs and apartments. And so a friend of ours, a very old family friend who was an editor at the Village Voice at the time, and she took pity, I think, on my mother, and said to me, "Well, why don't you?" I had some years before had been in the hospital for a year, and she said, "Why don't you write about that, and maybe we can run it in the Voice." So I did, and it ran. And that was, so I kind of really backed into what I had always wanted to do, but always been kind of afraid to do. And then while she was editing it, that piece, she would say, "Well, this won't work for the piece, save it for the novel." And she was so offhand about it that I thought, well, okay, maybe I can really do this. And then without telling anyone except her, I started on a novel, and I wrote a page a day. I mean, it was so frightening to me that I really had to chop it up into, it's like when you cut the meat into little pieces for your children and you just put, or the cooked carrots that they don't want to eat, and you just put a little bit on the plate. I had to not scare myself. So I wrote a page a day, but I wrote a page every day. And I didn't tell anyone because I was too familiar with too many of my friends saying, "Oh, I'm going to go write a novel," and talking about it so much and then never doing it. And I thought, if I'm going to do it, I'll do it, and then I'll tell people about it. And if I can't do it, then I'll know. But I did do it, and it took a year. I wrote a page a day, and it was about 365 pages, and that was Alice in Bed, and then I had a very lucky publishing history. That's the next. Another question that people often ask is, there's like two process questions. One is, what's your writing process, and another one is, how did you get your first book published? And at the time, I knew some people in journalism, and I said to them, I've written a really stupid novel. Do you know any really stupid agents? And they both, I remember they looked at each other in this funny way, and they said, yeah. And they gave me this name. This person became, one of the most important agents in New York. I mean, she became within a year one of the most important agents in New York. But anyway, I sent her the book, and she was not terribly impressed. She said, "Why did you do it as a novel if it was, if it had autobiographical elements?" And so I thought, if you can't see that, then maybe you really are stupid, and I don't want you to represent me. And then I got a name from someone else who turned out to be, I mean, I knew nothing. I was really innocent, but I was very lucky to sort of know people and ask them, not be afraid to ask them questions. And they said, a friend of mine said, you should send this to this agent. And it later turned out she was, a very serious literary agent, which I think if I had known that, I would have been afraid to send it to her. But she was she was about that tall. She looked kind of like Yoda. And she was a heavy smoker, so she talked like this. And you had to talk to her in the morning, because by the afternoon there had been too many martinis and things. And but she was a big, powerful, wonderful agent, wonderful person. So I gave it to her, and she called me. She was like on the train somewhere, and she got off the train to find a payphone. That's how long ago this was. And, and she called me and she said, "I go for it." So she went for it. So that was, I was just incredibly lucky to get her as an agent, and then and then she sold it for me. So that was my first book. One agent, two tries at an agent, one try at a publisher, at an editor, was bought, published. The next book, 9 editors turned it down before we finally got it sold. So you never know. So anyway, let me see if I have any other. Well, the other thing I was going to say was that in terms of my personal process of publishing, the first book took a year. The second book took 7 years because I had 2 little children. And I think that's, for women anyway, it's very common that, or at least it should, for anybody, it should sort of interfere somewhat in your work. And, I would work, and I'd be in my little office working, and then I'd hear the children playing, and I'd think, my deathless prose, the world can wait, but my kids are going to grow up, and I want to have fun with them. So I spent a lot of time playing with my children instead of doing my work. And then the other thing I would point out is that having started in journalism, for me, was a very good place for me to start. It was a very good background because it kind of cut through all of that self-importance and preciousness that I had as a teenager when I was writing all of that bad poetry, because you can't be Baroque when you're writing journalism. You have a deadline, you have a word count, and you have to really learn your craft. And for me, that was very important. I mean, writing is an art, obviously, but when you think about it, every art involves a lot of craft. And I think for me anyway, to keep my galloping ego in check, it's very, very important and self-importance. You start to think, oh, I'm a writer, and I'm writing, I know a lot of people who think, oh, I've got to write the best novel. Well, you're not going to write the best novel, probably, almost definitely. And so you might as well try to write the best novel you can write. And I find a lot of people get really paralyzed by thinking their work, especially young writers starting out, or not even young, older writers starting out. You think, well, what I'm writing, it's not brilliant, it's not great. Well, as your first draft, and as you do it, you can't be thinking it's got to be great. I think what I tend to do is think I've got to get to the end of this book. I've got to write the beginning, the middle, and the end, and with each phase of it, then go back and make it as good as it can be. But if you can't take a step without thinking, I mean, imagine if you were trying to walk across the room, but you felt that you had to look like one of Balanchine's dancers. You wouldn't get very far. And I think that's what a lot of writers do, and they literally trip themselves up. So I try to sort of aim for the mean and, aim low, and then keep going, and then get excited, and then make it better. And that's when people ask me advice for how to get started with a book or how to keep going with a book, that's what I tend to tell them, to not think like an artist, but think like a craftsman, and try to make it as beautiful. If you were making a shoe, you try to make it as beautiful a shoe as you possibly can, and it may turn out to be a great work of art. So now, if any of you have some questions. Yes, I think there's a microphone coming.
Curious whether you, when you start a novel, if you write an outline or if you just have an idea and you start writing and you wait for things to happen, things to suggest themselves to you.
I do not usually, I don't have an outline. When I start, I definitely don't have an outline. First of all, I barely have an idea usually when I start. But I have a sort of general sense of either a character or a place or a character in a place or two characters, and it's when I sort of put these things together that something comes to life. I have to sort of see what the characters do or how they feel about certain things before I really understand what I'm writing about. And for example, with Finn and Lady, when I started, I thought of it as more of a comic book in the tradition of Auntie Mame or something like that. And then when I started writing it, the minute I started writing it and I put the characters down on the page, I thought, wait a minute, this little boy just lost both his parents. This is not a sitcom. This is not an easy, skippy, happy comedy. There's a lot of tragedy here, in which there's often comedy as well. But it turned the book in a way that, in my very earliest thinking of it, I hadn't really addressed that. And when I first wrote the character of Lady, she was not a very good character. She was very brittle, very arch, kind of sarcastic, and she didn't really turn into the character I wanted her to be until she met Finn, and there was a lot of interaction between them, and then the two of them kind of brought each other to life on the page, and also kind of told me where the plot would go and what would happen. I knew certain things, but and I had a general idea of the direction of it, but nothing that you would call an outline. Sometimes in the middle of a book, I'll outline what I've already done to see, because sometimes, I once had someone who was pregnant for 11 months, and it was not an elephant, it was a person. And so it's good to look back and make outlines of what you've already done to kind of see what's missing and what can go here. But the one time that I did make out a whole outline for a whole book, I never wrote the book because I was so bored. I knew what would happen. I saw it all there, and I thought, well, I don't want to write this book. I already know what it is, so what's the point? So I never wrote that book. I know other people work very differently, but I sort of wander and eventually get where I'm going. Everything is about rewriting, to sharpen it and make it better. Are you my Twitter friend?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
This is my very first Twitter friend, Twitter follower, whatever it is. I'm so excited. Hello.
It's so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too.
And thank you. You really helped me through, or your humor has helped me so much through some difficult times. So, and I wanted to ask you about that as well. But I just, also as a follow-up to what the woman behind me had just asked, when you start writing and you don't know where you're going, that doesn't instill any fear in you, and it does. Okay.
Yeah,
I was just wondering.
It does, but the first two books I wrote were kind of autobiographical, so I did have an idea of where I was going. The problem was it was almost too much of an idea, and sometimes I would say, well, this really happened, so why can't I put it in? But it didn't work for the book, so I would have to change it. But that's a different problem when you're using, a kind of autobiographical sort of narrative arc. You have to you have to change things, and you have to be willing to change things that, even though they happen to you and they're very dear to you, you have to be willing to sort of, twist them and change them in ways that are less familiar and less intimate, or, because it works with the character and with the actual book. But in the books that are, in all the other books, which are not autobiographical, it is. It's always, I'm always worried. First of all, I'm always worried that I'll never have another idea. I mean, always. Literally the minute I finish a book, I think, oh God, I'll never have another idea, and I'll never write another book. And, it's too bad, but I guess I'll have to, retire at, 30, 50, whatever age it is. But then, somehow I squeeze an idea out, and then when you start working on it, you think, well, okay, it's an idea, but it's not a plot, it's not a story. What is it? It's just an idea. Maybe it's just a certain kind of conflict that you're interested in examining. And so, over the years, I've sort of gotten to just, I guess it's called denial, I think is what, you just say, something will happen. This will work eventually. And just keep going. But yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, all things kept in proportion. But when you don't know, I mean, once you get the characters and they're alive and they exist, then it becomes fun rather than scary. But that first part where you don't really know who the people are, and you just have this very, very sketchy idea of them, that's hard. And then suddenly they come alive, and it's very exciting, and you think, ooh, I wonder what they're going to do next, and oh, I wonder if they'll do this, and I could try. What if this happens? And then you try it and see how it works, and that's when it gets fun and exciting.
I just wanted to ask you, what do you attribute your humor to? Like, where do you get it from? Because it's just amazing. I love it.
My mother is sitting right there. And I mean, really and truly, and my grandmother, who was really, really funny. I come from a funny family, and humor is valued, and I think also having gone through some difficulties at a young age when I was in the hospital and everything, I think you develop a sense of humor, or you turn into a very bitter, unhappy person, and nurse a grudge for the rest of your life. And luckily, I sort of was able to come through it with a lot of humor, and a lot of that had to do with my mother and her funny friends who are also here. But I mean, if that's a value, if you grow up with everyone being a kind of clown,
Thank you.
excuse me, being a very witty, sophisticated, full of witty repartee, if you're lucky, it rubs off, and it becomes a way of viewing the world rather than, just jokes. Or, I mean, I'm not good at jokes, and but it sort of helped me sort of, view the world and put one foot in front of the other. So, and it's what I enjoy. I mean, I know some people write about very, very dark things, and that's what they enjoy, scaring themselves, and it's not what I really like to do. I like to laugh, and it's what I see. I don't see all the horrible, scary things. I see little funny things, and so that's what I write about.
Okay, thank you. I come from basically an IT
technical background, so I took early retirement from teaching. And I've got into some, I really don't have a liberal arts per se background. So I see things like, I'd like you to, clarify this a little. Like they say Hemingway is a male writer. Okay, let me just continue on this theme. Harold Pintner writes plays. He wrote a play called The Homecoming. You could almost call him a misogynist for the play. A fabulous piece of work, but that type of thing. And I got into light reading, like mystery fiction, where it seems more alive, not because of the two I mentioned, like John Grisham, Mary Higgins Clark, and Nicholas Sparks. And they seem. And I started reading To the Lighthouse with Virginia Woolf, and I got through 50 pages, and I can't say it was exciting.
No.
Honestly, but this clarification, male writer, female writer, and some comments about Hemi, the comment is there such a thing as a male writer or a female writer? That type of thing.
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, obviously there is. There are men who write. Those are the male writers. The women who write are the women writers. The question then is, can men write about women, and can men write for women? And on the other hand, can women write about men, and can they write books that men are interested in? If you look at the 19th century writers, you see the great English writers. There's Jane Austen and there's George Eliot, and they're, up there with Dickens and Thackeray and Trollope, and it's really no question. And I think it's funny about Virginia Woolf, it took me a long, long time to be able to appreciate, and I just barely do, Virginia Woolf. But the excitement about Virginia Woolf when she first started writing was that it was so different, and that the rhythm of the world and the rhythm of her words were so different from what people were used to reading. And the same thing, to a certain extent, is true about Hemingway. Now, it's also kind of interesting that what Virginia Woolf was writing about was a luncheon party, I think an afternoon party, and Hemingway was writing about bullfights and things like that. I mean, that's a matter of taste, and they're very different, although they overlapped in time. But I think in terms of now, when I first started writing, this was just not something that people really talked about or cared about or thought about, and there were a lot of well-respected women writers and male writers, and when my first book was reviewed, it was just reviewed as a book, not as a book by a woman writer. As the years went on, there was this publishing phenomenon, which was chick lit, which is a commercial phenomenon, which a lot of young women were buying a certain kind of book about finding a guy, and they were romantic novels, but they were funny, and suddenly I discovered that I wrote chick lit, including books that I had written before there was anything called chick lit, and people were constantly asking me, did I mind being relegated to this, to this status of a woman writer, and obviously a woman writer writes chick lit. And at first I did, but then I started hearing people say that Jane Austen wrote chick lit. And then I thought, well, obviously all they're saying is that if you're a woman and you write a book and it's a comedy of manners and there are women in it, then suddenly you're writing chick lit because it makes it more marketable. And I realized it was really just a publishing. And a lot of times when there are those categories, it has to do with just fashion or publishing or something like that. Now, I know a lot of women who read John Grisham, and I know a lot of men. I used to think only women read novels. That was my theory, and that men only read nonfiction or thrillers. And I don't think that's true anymore. I've gotten too many letters from men who've read my books, and I think that was a prejudice on my part. But you know, when I got out of graduate school, I had not read a book in English, a novel in English, since high school. You know, all I read were medieval documents in Latin. And so the first time I picked up a book, someone left it at my house, and I started reading a novel by Dickens, and I thought it was like a miracle. It was like the sun had risen. And I suddenly thought, oh my God, look what you can do. Look at the English language. Why was I messing around with Latin, which is so constricted? And look at this, and it's so wonderful and so funny, and it's so sad. And I started reading a lot. I mean, for a long time, I couldn't place the book. I couldn't figure out, is this romantic? Is this modern? Is this postmodern? What's going on? And it made me very uncomfortable because I didn't understand, because I hadn't had an education in English literature where I knew what went into each category. And that was hard, and at first I felt very unmoored. But in a way, I think that's really good, and I think it's good that you're just reading and that you shouldn't worry about these categories, because a lot of times they're inaccurate, and what's really exciting is the text that you have in front of you. And sometimes you recognize a link to another book written by the same writer or written in the same period, and then you start to get a feeling of that, if it's a genre, of that genre or of that period. You're coming at it from a more authentic way, and I think that's actually, you're really lucky that you get to do that. I mean, that's a gift. So I wouldn't worry about it at all.
Thank you.
Wait, you're supposed to wait. Mother.
I have my hearing aids on tonight. I can't. On a contemporary level, those old Firth, the old Firth books, you know, the trilogy, Old Filth.
Oh, Old Filth, yeah, the Jane Gardam
The
novels.
Jane Gardam.
Yeah.
It seems as though men and women like those books.
Well, in England, there really is not. She's an English writer, Jane Gardam. She's wonderful, and very, very well known in England and less well known here. But I think this is less. I think it's less of an issue in England than it is here. And there's also the issue of comic writing, which, you know, Woody Allen said, you know, he was always at the children's table. And I mean, that's not true anymore. He's now this revered icon. But comedy also is a disadvantage to being taken seriously. But who cares? You know, if your readers take you seriously, then that's what you need and why you're doing it.
When you're writing a novel, do you feel apprehensive ever when you start writing about a character that is not at all relatable to you, like an older man or a young man or someone who's lived through things that you haven't lived through? Do you ever feel like you're not inadequate, you don't have an adequate,
Background,
to write about that?
Yes, I do, and it's hard, but then I also realize it's almost always like that, even if it's a character who has gone through some of the things that I've gone through, because you're always making them up. But it's true. When I started writing Finn and Lady, Finn it took place a little bit farther in the past, and I realized that I couldn't get the feel of Finn. I couldn't get it right. I mean, I could handle that he was a little boy, but I could not handle that he was a little boy who was, 6 years older than I was. I needed to he's exactly the same age. He was born right about when I was born, because I needed those references and those feelings and those reactions to make him real. My imagination and my observation and my reading could handle the fact that he was a boy, and I could write about a period in the past, but I couldn't have it be. It was becoming a research project rather than a character that I really felt, and so I just moved his birthday up, and then he really started to kind of sing, and then it was, and also a lot of it is what what you enjoy doing. I mean, it's always a challenge. I sometimes write things that are hard for me, that I'm not thrilled about starting out on. But if you're writing something and you just feel that it's drudgery and you're looking things up and you can't imagine what this character would think or feel, then it's probably not a good character. But on the other hand, I think people write about characters that that do things that they haven't done all the time, and I think it's a question of imagination, and you think, well, either what would I feel, or if I were this kind of person, what would I feel, or how would I react, or if it's not a character whose voice you're using, you've observed, you can observe people who do things that are not like you, that are, and have them be the object of the narrative rather than the subject. But it's always this kind of dance to try to find something that's new and fresh, but at the same time real to you, because if you're writing something that's so new and fresh that you don't understand it or can't relate to it, then it's not going to work. But if you're only writing about basically yourself and your own observations and feelings as you've had them all your life, then it's going to be boring to me and boring to everyone else. So it's a kind of little dance that you do with the characters.
Are there any more questions? Okay. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you very much, all of you.